Great. Thank you all for coming. This is going to be a very interesting discussion this morning. I can tell you already, I think you've all been told to turn off your cell phones. I think I would add to that the warning that if you're thinking of writing any emails, assume they will be hacked someday and shown on the Jumbotron at Times Square. So be careful what you put in electronic communications. Ellen Kullman has been CEO of DuPont since 2009. Yep. DuPont has been around for 212 years.
Correct.
You had a long and distinguished career at the company, serving as president, executive vice president. You started a life sciences, industrial biosciences, and also the sustainability solutions. So you know the company inside out. We used to think of DuPont as a chemical company. You refer to it as an innovation company. Tell us what you mean.
Well, we call it a science company, and so innovation, I think another company has the corner on that. But
really? Can you trademark something like that?
I don't know. We just don't want the confusion factor. You know, it's interesting. I've been with the company 26 years, came mid-career, and fell in love with the company wandering around the laboratories and understanding the science and how powerful the science is. And really have had a great time over the last 26 years connecting that science to the marketplace. So we call ourselves a science company because chemistry is very important, but the most interesting things today are happening at the intersection of sciences, taking it to a nanoscale or adding biology to chemistry and material science and engineering. Because science itself is interesting, but it's only relevant if you can take it to a scale at a cost that your customers then benefit from it. So we are very proud of our chemical heritage, but are moving forward because of where the most fundamental and exciting innovation is occurring today.
There's a tendency today to think the most exciting innovation occurs in garages. You know, it happens in Silicon Valley. It gets funded by venture capital companies, and that big companies somehow can't do that. You obviously don't buy that.
Well, I think that entrepreneurism starting in a garage is an important part of a total innovation ecosystem. But in itself is not sufficient, because what we find, and we are very active, our innovation model has changed greatly over the last 20 years. And as we're out working in the marketplace, excuse me, they focus on individual aspects of it. But to get it to market, it has to be integrated into more of a system approach. And so we're finding that small, innovative companies need to partner many times, not always, but because that scale and cost and market access are very important parts of it. So we've evolved where we innovate locally, not just as we did 20 years ago in a big center in Wilmington, Delaware, or in the agriculture area in Des Moines, Iowa. But we innovate locally in over 100 different smaller research centers around the world, and then connect them together globally through our processes that we use to connect to the customers.
So give us a few examples of great scientific innovations that have come out of DuPont Labs recently.
So if you think about large product innovation, so we talk about innovation in three areas. There's small, incremental or medium size that you have to do every day just to be in the game. So it's that next application of Kevlar. It's putting Suralin in the new Nike golf ball. It's putting Tedlar on the Goodyear blimp. There's thousands of those that occur every year. The larger product category, if you think about three in the last few years, Rynaxypyr, a novel crop protection. It's an insecticide that paralyzes the bug. That's its mode of action. And it is low toxicity, human friendly. And it has been accepted by regulatory regimes around the world, went from zero in revenues to $1 billion in revenues in 5 years. Wow. Probably took us 15 years to get it to where it is today. Because regulatory environments, the testing you need to do to make sure of where it resides in the whole ecosystem, I mean, that's been a tremendous success. If if you look at Solamet paste, back when I started with the photovoltaics industry, we were thinking crystalline silicon 12% was great. Okay, now it's 19, approaching 20. Good part of that is the metallized paste that's used to collect the energy from the cell. And DuPont, that's called Solamet paste. You think about, everybody talks biotech is a big thing in ag, and it's very important. But we came up with a native drought-tolerant trait. So Aquamax, it's on 10% of the total corn acres in the United States, not just our acres, the total corn acres in the United States. And it yields 9% more in drought-stressed areas than other varieties, and it's not a yield drag if it's not drought-stressed. So, those are the types of product innovations come out. Then there's the large innovations, new. So think cellulosic ethanol. Think about being able to break down stover and cob and being able to translate that into ethanol. And our plant in Nevada, Iowa is finalizing mechanical completion. We'll be up and running in the second quarter of next year. It's a 30 million gallon plant. So we work in all three aspects of innovation in order to be able to create growth.
Well, let's talk about a couple of those. The ethanol piece, there was this bubble of interest in ethanol 5 or 6 years ago, but then it pulled back because a lot of it was being made with corn and the stress on the food system and so forth. Do you still think ethanol is a big part of the answer to the energy problem?
I think it's going to be second or third generation biofuels that are going to be the answer, not the first generation.
So it'll take a while.
Right. So, actually, there's 3 cellulosic ethanol plants that are in the process of coming up and running. It'll be running by the second quarter of next year. 3 scale plants in the United States. We're one of them. We're working on butanol with BP. Butanol is a different molecule. It doesn't have the energy degradation. You can move it. It doesn't absorb water. You can move it in the transportation system. It doesn't have to be moved separately. It doesn't have the vapor pressure issues in the summer, gas caps popping off, things like that. It's a little behind cellulosic ethanol. But these major transitions, it takes partnership. It takes government support, like the Renewable Fuel Standard. And, we're going to get there. And, I think we as a country, regardless of the price of oil today, have to continue to think about energy independence. All countries are doing that. And, Brazil, China, those types of places who have large biomass are looking to how they use that biomass to create economic growth.
Is your corporate interest in alternative fuels affected at all by the oil price?
Well, obviously, the economics are always affected by the oil price, right? And you always have to take a look and see where that comes out. The interesting thing about the price of oil right now is that it is, a lot of the research reports we see say it's going to drive miles up. People are going to drive more because the price of gas is low. When they have to drive more based on the renewable fuel standard, there's going to be more ethanol in the system. And so actually the ethanol producers are thinking short term that's good. Now, if you can tell me based on all your research where oil's going to, end up, in a year's time, it'd be really helpful.
Unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that question, but you have to make assumptions about answers to questions like that in order to decide where to place your bets.
Yeah, every day this week I'm getting a different answer. So I'm hoping in a couple of weeks it'll settle down.
It'll settle out at some point. The other interesting issue, you talked about the new strain of corn that yields 9% more in drought circumstances, but you've got this public backlash, in some places at least, in Europe, in Vermont, in California, against genetically modified food. How do you deal with that at DuPont?
So Aquamax is a native trait, so it's not genetically modified. But we do sell a tremendous amount of genetically modified corn and soy out there. And the interesting thing is that if you think about how the grain industry has grown over the last 60, 70 years, hybridization, and the continued of picking the winners and breeding and creating strength over time. Genetic modification, think about it as doing that on steroids a little bit. Now, no reference to any kind of sporting events, but and imparting the ability for it to utilize less crop protection products and protecting it from weeds, insects, fungus, things like that. Our country, we have a hard frost every year. So you kind of get the bugs out of the system. In a place like Brazil, there's no hard frost in the main growing areas. And the insect pressure is huge. And you have to balance many things. But in the facts of a growing world, from a population standpoint, we're going to need more food, more grains, and we're going to have to grow it in the same amount of land we have now. I mean, there's tremendous pressure on land use. And so we need to get the most out of that. Now, genetic modification has been around for 15 years. It has been studied tremendously. There are no known health effects. And
You're saying it's basically no different than the natural selection processes you used before that.
you know,
just faster.
it's studied, right? It is faster, and you can utilize less crop protection products, things like that, because the seed's better protected. Now, there's new sciences coming up that aren't genetically modified, biologicals. So naturally derived products that maybe you coat a seed or you integress into a seed that creates protection. So science keeps moving forward. And so, you know, how we think about, you know, I was told one time by, you know, a member of Congress that we just had a branding problem, that if we just didn't call it GMOs, it'd be okay. Genetic modification was a thing. And so I'm not sure how you change it now. But I think part of the issue is that we need to better, as industry, we need to better educate populations around, in a very open, transparent, scientifically based framework, about the realities of what science brings and the risks it brings as well. You know, you take a risk crossing the street in New York City getting hit by a bus or a cab. And so what risks do we as humans take on? And I don't think we're doing a good enough job educating our kids about.
But when you say we need to educate, you're not talking about DuPont, because obviously that's a challenge for DuPont to go out there and say these things. You're talking about generally speaking.
I think it's both. I think we need to make sure that we're doing a good job in a very transparent way talking about what it is. But I also am passionate about increasing and creating modern engagement of our youngsters starting at a very young age in terms of science and math and agronomy, and talking about it in a positive way and talking about it in a way that builds economic growth and creates a better future for.
I want to come back to that and talk about education, but what strikes me in the GMO debate is that many of the people who raise these questions are in fact, at least on paper, very well educated. You know, it happens in highly educated, it happens in the cities in California, it happens among, and it happens in highly educated populations in Europe.
So I think it depends on how you define your world, right? If you define your world as your state or your country, the answer may be one thing. If you define your world as the globe, and you understand what the differences are in agricultural productivity around the world, about access to safe and reliable food sources around the world, you might have a different attitude.
Look at it. And can you deal, as a company, can you deal with those differences in attitudes with different products?
You know, we're very, we create not only genetically modified seeds, we have hybrids, and we have large opportunities in Europe. We participate very strongly in Europe with non-GMO products because that is what their regulatory environment has put forward. That's what we will respond to.
But you can't meet the needs of the developing world without.
Well, in the developing world, it's interesting because they're still in many areas in open pollination. You know, think scattering seeds type of thing. And we're moving them into modern agronomy techniques, hybrids, moving first. And then they have to work up that food chain. It's hard to take populations that have subsistence farming experience and move them into modern agriculture. You've got to do a lot of training, education. You've got to work with aid organizations and governments. You've got to cultivate locally because, you know, corn, soy, very locally oriented. They've got to withstand the local conditions, soil, weather, things like that. So you've got to work your way up there. But I think if holistically, you know, if our population growth continues, that you're going to need science and aspects of science to get us there.
It's not just, it's population growth and it's the affluence of the population. It's
correct.
A
Moving
growing
into
middle class. People want to eat
Absolutely.
like they're in the middle class.
Correct.
Change the subject a little bit. DuPont is coming under attack from an activist investor, Nelson Peltz. I think your proxy submissions have to be made sometime next month. Here, at least there's a possibility, you know, he'll go after a couple of board seats. How do you feel about that?
Well, so we're very active with our investors. We talk to them. You know, we work with them, understand their points of view. You know, what happens there will we'll see. We'll all see.
But
But
his view is the company needs to split in two, that the agricultural businesses should be separated from the rest.
you know, it's interesting because the company I entered 25 years ago is very different than the company today. We've been a very active portfolio manager. Just in the last 6 years, we've sold our coatings business. We're spinning our chemicals business. We've had 6 different small dispositions this year of small product lines that had kind of peaked out on where innovation and science could drive growth. And there's consolidation in those areas. And glass laminating solutions is, you know, one of the latest ones, and that's going in that direction with Kuraray, a Japanese company. So we're very active portfolio managers. We've done deep portfolio analysis. You know, the interesting part about starting my job, when I did in the beginning of '09, was that we saw very clearly how each product line, excuse me, reacted to a difficult economic situation. We saw where they were strong, where they were weak, their competitiveness, and we took action. You know, improve the business, drive science into it to create new products, new enterprise, portfolio actions to change the portfolio, and we've done that tremendously. What we have found through that is the leveraging of the science, adding biology, material science, engineering, chemistry together, and using our global reach, value chain knowledge creates opportunities for our company, differential to our competition, in areas of ag and nutrition, advanced materials, and industrial biosciences. And now that's ours to prove, but we have actively managed the portfolio, and we see the connectiveness and the growth capability of what is there now.
So trade in, trade out, but don't chop it in half.
Well, we think that there's that deleveraging that you get has a negative impact on the whole, and I think that that's something that we, as management and the board of directors, take very seriously, and we actively work.
I assume you've had this conversation with Nelson Peltz.
We've actively involved with all our shareholders, absolutely.
The other criticism he's making is that that your costs are too high. I mean, I'd be interested. People will always say that, and you can always make the arguments. But the interesting thing about DuPont is it has this long history, and so it's been through these very different eras of the corporate sense of responsibility. I mean, I was up there and toured the original powder making plants when you provided housing. Your workers lived right there. They were on the site. He's saying get rid of the hotel, get rid of the theater, get rid of some of the legacy of that tradition to save the company money.
Well, look, hospitality, all that is a business unit, breaks even plus or minus, right? So it's not a burden to the company. So that's sort of an interesting argument, but it's not relevant
but
to
now
return
there's
to the
no real portfolio value to having a big hotel in.
No, and we're constantly looking at options, but we're in Wilmington, Delaware, and
they care about you, and you care about them.
Well, no, what I mean is it's not necessarily one of those cities that large hotel chains are flocking to, but you have to, you have to call it for what it is. But let's talk about the legacy of DuPont, because I think that's an interesting place to go. We change as a company constantly. 100 years ago, 3 cousins, when the head of the company died, about 106 years ago, 3 cousins did one of the largest leverage buyouts, well, back then, I think ever, but, and took the company. The family took debt, right, and converted the stock, and they started it on its course of modern chemistry. And they built the experimental station. They built laboratories. They invented things like nylon and, Kevlar and Nomex and Tyvek and, fluorochemicals for refrigerants. I mean, we came up with the fast bake for automotive paints, enabling mass manufacturing of automobiles back in the 1920s type of thing. And so, they started that innovation engine, but that innovation engine's changed a lot, and it has to change. And so as we came through and literally are moving 30% of the company outside in the last 6 years, we said, we've got to rethink of who we are as a corporate center, and we have to make sure that we're not holding on to history and that we are modernizing it. And so it's something we announced, 6 months ago. We call it Fresh Start. And we've used outside help to bring benchmarks and hold the mirror up to say, why are you doing this? And recasting the corporate center, taking $1 billion of cost out over the next few years. We got to modernize some systems. We need to invest in a modern transactional backbone, standardized backbone, and things like that, which is in process. But I very much believe that you have to honor the history, but you've got to always look forward. And you have to balance. I mean, I'm a big believer that we only operate in the communities where we operate because we're a good citizen, and being a good citizen is part of it. But that has more to do with the volunteerism of my people, right? And the employees at DuPont are tremendously generous with their time in the communities that we operate in. We're very proud of that, and work with community organizations. And so it has to all work together to create that stability to go forward. But we're very much not thinking there's things that are sacred cows or things that can't change.
One more question about Nelson Peltz, and then I promise I'll stop. Before he went after you, he went after Indra Nooyi at Pepsi. Before he went after Indra Nooyi at Pepsi, he went after Irene Rosenfeld at Kraft. What do the three of you have in common?
Well, they're not all engineers, so I have to stop there. Well,
Well, you're in the food business.
No, I wouldn't go there. But, so it is what it is, right? I'm a realist. I'm somebody that says that you just, understand what the world is and you address it.
Well, how about look at it more broadly, because I realize it's complicated talking about the specific case, but look at it more broadly. Are activist investors playing a useful role in our business and economic system?
The interesting thing is that, historically, big business wasn't very transparent. Go back decades. Now there's much more transparency in the system. Everything we do is under a microscope. If you think about the kind of information we have to file from a regulatory standpoint, if you think about anything that gets in the news today, right, type of thing. I think the world's changed. I think the days when you had boards that were insular and weren't actively engaged in creating a strong future and shareholder value. I mean, I think that's not the world I live in. The world I live in is a very active board. It's very focused on creating value. It's active engagement around that stuff. So, I understand that shareholders, many who aren't as public with their comments, they have strong views, and I learn from that. And I'm always open to listening to it, because the interesting thing is when you sit inside a company and you live and breathe it every day, the question is, what aren't you seeing? And my job is to make sure that we're seeing things. And I travel a lot. I spend a lot of time with customers, with governments. I spend a lot of time up and down our value chain, understanding their world, to understand how it can impact mine. Yeah. I spend a lot of time with shareholders. Same thing. And that informs us, our leadership, our board, into how we can create more value, and it challenges us to think in different ways.
How about the kind of short-term, long-term issues? I mean, one of the interesting things as an observer of the business scene about where we are today is that, in the kind of East Coast companies like yours or an IBM, there's this enormous pressure to provide returns to shareholders in the short term, and then you go to the West Coast and you find companies that aren't even thinking about making money.
Does that mean I should move my headquarters to the West Coast?
Well, maybe. I don't know. So how do you watch
I hadn't thought about that. I can put that in my.
How do you explain that?
Yeah.
I mean, you're a technology company, and yet you seem to be forced by your shareholders to operate under different rules than Amazon has to operate under.
Interesting question. I'm sure you can wax philanthropically on that. But I believe it's an and equation, not an or equation. I think, you've got to make short-term commitments. The environment is what it is, and it's all about beating the competition. And when I started 2014, I didn't understand fully where the ag economy was going. So am I, where I wanted to be with ag? No. But how am I doing versus a Syngenta or a Monsanto or others in that area is how the external world should judge us or them from that standpoint, because the environment's the same for everybody. Mm-hmm. But I see that I am, and our company, is present management, is greatly enabled by decisions that were made 10 and 20 years ago by our predecessors. the places they put the investment, the things that they, I mean, whether it was opening up China or whether it was an investment in a certain research area. Because of those decisions, not all perfect by any stretch of the imagination, we've got a hand and a set of opportunities that's ours to play out. Without those, if they hadn't invested in the fundamental research capability in insecticides, we were the herbicide company. 20 years ago, we didn't have, much in the insecticide world. They made those decisions to branch out into that area. We invented Rynaxypyr, right? I mean, so we're benefiting from that long-term view. And I take very seriously my role in creating that for the future. My shareholders want a long-term perspective on DuPont. And so it is an innovation ecosystem that has to continue to have a pipeline that delivers, but invest in the long term to create that for the long.
I want to go back to education because you referred to that earlier, and I know it's something you're very passionate about and you devote some of your time and energy to. Can you talk a little bit about not just what you see as the problem, but what you think the solution might be that you can contribute to?
So, the problem is broad. I watched my kids coming up through, elementary school, middle school, and they're making volcanoes.
Yeah.
Baking soda thing, right?
Yes.
Okay. How many volcanoes do you and I deal with on a daily basis? Not many. So why aren't they teaching them mechanics? Why aren't they showing them how an internal combustion engine works? Why aren't they showing them, the world around them? The science curriculum in schools, it's the same curriculum that I grew up with.
It's broken.
And the world is a very different place today. And there are a lot of people who are doing good things there. I mean, the Boston Museum of Science and has a whole series of engagements for young children around, multicultural, multi-scientific discipline, real-world problems. How do you get clean water in a rural area in India, and engaging children on that level? And that's what we need. Our kids need to understand that science isn't scary. Science can help you build a better world, but we have to be engaged in it. And I think we talk about to our kids that science and math are hard. Life's hard, right? I'm not sure. I mean, writing a good paper was hard for my sons, but they are doing well in engineering school, right? But we have to engage our children in a way that lets them understand that they're part of building that future, but it comes from embracing science and math and agronomy, and as opposed to saying, well, I'm just going to go in a different direction.
And how do you make that happen, particularly in a decentralized education system like the one we have?
Teacher education, starting in preschool. I mean, there are a lot of fundamentals, that come into it that are leverageable, right, across the whole. I mean, I just met with a young man that graduated from high school with my daughter in Teach for America. Now he's moving from after his second year at Teach for America. He's working now on figuring out how to help the state get better principals in place, because there's a clear correlation between inner city schools, the quality of the principal. It's not about tenure, it's about capability, and increasing test scores, increasing the learning environment for these kids. And so, you have to start locally, but the question is then how do we leverage it across the country? Because you go into China, you go into India, their kids are studying stuff our kids need to be studying.
Yeah.
And I think for the U.S., from a U.S. competitiveness standpoint, I think that's a critical part of it.
DuPont is a global company, but you took over as CEO at a time when global trade was shrinking, stagnating, not growing the way it had been before. How does that affect you?
Yeah, so I think that if for American companies like mine to be competitive, we need a tax policy that's relevant. We need trade policies that enable. There's a lot of work going on in
tax policy that's relevant, meaning a tax policy that allows freer movement of money and lower rates of U.S. tax.
Yeah, most of my competitors aren't U.S.-based companies. Most of my competitors are Japanese, they're German, they're Brazilian, a lot of them coming up in China, in Korea.
And do they all have a tax advantage over you?
Not all, many. But that shouldn't be the differentiator in competitiveness. And, you know, it's not like that much of the US budget comes from corporations. A little bit does, but not a lot. But I would think that the US would want to create strong companies at whatever size to be able to create, you know, strong business globally. And that's going to create employment, it's going to create economic growth, it's going to create investment. And I think that we can be part of that solution.
How about trade? Trade barriers. Are you seeing that as an issue for?
Yeah, and it's, you know, so everybody wants their companies in their country to win. You've got some very powerful governments who are focused on making sure that they get theirs for their companies because they've got issues, whether it's employment and making sure that their people have a future. And, you know, you see a little bit of protectionism rising in places. We work, you know, with our government very clearly, pointing to places, engaging them. They've been very helpful. They're working towards that. There's a lot going on, you know, from a bilateral investment treaty, I think is very important from what's going on in Chicago now with China and things like that, and we just have to continue to work it. But I think, you know, I do manufacture a lot in the United States. I do export quite a bit. And so that is important to me.
Good. Why don't we open it up to the group here? I'm sure there are a lot of questions. People came armed with questions. So we have some microphones. And please identify yourself before you ask your question. We'll start there in the back.
My name is Andrew Gunlock, First Eagle Investment Management. Question of long-term innovation. Your companies, industrial companies, have long product life cycles, unlike the Amazons, which are much shorter. And Wall Street hates science projects. And long-term innovation takes a lot of time, obviously. And I wonder whether or not the solution, it's not only for DuPont, but also for Dow and others, where they seem to have lost this spirit of long-term innovation because Wall Street won't tolerate it. And whether or not the basic research that we do in the United States, financed in the 501c3s, usually schools, is superb. But whether or not it needs to be extended, and therefore your companies can appease Wall Street and do the R&D in the 501c3 model.
Nonprofit subsidiaries.
So we spend about 10%, we spend about $2.2 billion a year on research and development. We spend about 10% of it on long-term research in our in 2 centers in the United States. Those centers actively work outside with universities and other areas to extend. But the one thing about long-term research is if you're consistent in it, it's not a burden. It's part of the infrastructure. And you test it and you understand what it delivers. Into the businesses, the 12 businesses in our company that draw from it. But we have a great, in the scientific community, we have a great brand at the Experimental Station and the Johnston Research Centers, and we draw people into that. And that's important for our innovation ecosystem. But we've expanded it out to include those kind of connections because not everything happens within our walls by any stretch of the imagination, and we have to have that connectedness, whether it's into government laboratories, university laboratories, small companies. And so that ecosystem has changed a lot in the last 10 years, but it still does represent about 10% of our research dollars.
That's been steady for a long time?
It has been.
Question back there.
I'm a journalist. Coming back to education.
I'm sorry, a journalist with?
I work for El País, the Spanish daily. My name is Sandro Pozzi. Coming back to education, basically the young people, they want to do apps for like WhatsApp and to be millionaires, no? How difficult is for you to find engineers? I mean, they are vital for the survival of your company. Do you have to look them here in the United States or more abroad? Because they are more into science, not into coding.
You know, it's interesting to me that music and arts and engineering aren't that far apart in the brain. And you get the right teachers at the right level, they can connect it and make the engineering fun. Geometry is a big part of art, things like that. One of my sons is I have 2 sons that are in engineering school, but one of them is great. It's taught himself the piano, and believe me, I don't have a musical bone in my body, and I'm phenomenally impressed at how he's connected the two. But we look everywhere for talent. You know, we look in the United States, we have relationships with great universities. I have large laboratories in China, in India, in Brazil, got smaller laboratories dotted around the world. And we look, you know, everywhere for talent. And, you know, there is in the United States, you know, that's more of an issue for us and we have to work it harder. But I think there's a, you know, if we teach kids that engineering is not about tough science, it's about problem solving. It's about creativity in a disciplined way to really get at some of these problems. You can really spark an interest and a drive there. But I tend to think of it, you know, I call a lot of things either or equations or and equations, and this is an and equation. You know, we have to have strong engineering and scientific focus in the United States. I also need it elsewhere in the world because it is, you know, the biggest part of growth for our company comes from localizing the science to the needs of the local community. And so you might be able to invent a new molecule in Wilmington, but in order to apply it in sub-Saharan Africa, you got to work locally in terms of creating that.
But you know, both these questions do raise a really interesting broad business question. I mean, the interesting innovations that have dramatically changed our lives over the last 2 decades have been coding innovations, right? Mostly IT. It has to be true that in the next 2 decades that the life science innovations will have as much or bigger effect on our lives as coding innovations have.
So coding innovations has affected my life greatly, not personally, professionally. You think about a molecule finding a reaction in millions of possibilities. You can't do that without coding a system to run through it and to tell you what are the 10 or 100 that are the most reasonable prospects to get there. So we use computers and science and coding and intelligence, you know, artificial intelligence to really point us in the direction of what is the highest probability to get to a Rynaxypyr. Mm-hmm. And those high throughput screening is absolutely imperative, right? And so that's an enabler.
So they're coming together.
It's coming together. So that's an enabler. But I do think that that biology offers tremendous opportunity. We've seen it in pharmaceuticals. We've seen it in agriculture. We're starting to see it in things like personal care. Maybe it's not the most exciting innovation, but you know, but I love it. Tide detergents are enzymes, cold water. So you can get the same cleaning in cold water, save energy. You couldn't do that 5 years ago. So, and so in that personal care, home care, industry, you know, when I go talk to automotive manufacturers, you know, this Prius generation, they want, you know, the highest energy efficiency, but they want renewable materials. And so there's coming together in this way that I think is going to create a very exciting
I guess the
future.
question is, how do you get the financiers and the kids as excited about that as they are about the latest social sharing app?
Well, I am the chief recruiting officer for my company too, and I love it actually. You know, I get my energy by going out into the world and understanding what's going on. And I hit universities when I'm in these countries or these towns in the United States, and you know, I'll do a fireside chat with the head of a business school or the head of an engineering school. I'll go in and do small group meetings. I'll walk their laboratories with them. I'll spend a few hours there. And I'm talking to these kids about what DuPont is and what they can do if they come to work for us or come to an internship. So, you know, because what they think about DuPont, they think about the chemical company that you mentioned when we started the conversation. They don't think about nutritious food ingredients. They don't think about enzymes and what they can do. They don't think about advanced materials and using Kevlar not only to protect people, but, you know, Kevlar's under the hood of your car, Kevlar's in sails, Kevlar's in airframes to lightweight them. You know, Kevlar's in your kid's hockey helmet. So, you know, it's just everywhere. And those kind of application development is very exciting. But most people want to work on the Nike golf ball account, I can tell you that one.
Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone, yeah.
William Hazeltine, Access Health. You work in science, you work in biology, you work in materials. One of the biggest applications for those is the healthcare industry, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's new materials for rebuilding organs, a whole series of applications. I wonder what your thoughts are of applying your set of technologies to this enormous sector of business.
Yeah, we had a large life sciences healthcare sector about a decade and a half ago. It seemed like the company back then got to a point where they had to make a choice. You know, we were growing agriculture and food, we were growing advanced materials, and we sold that off to Bristol Myers Squibb. And then we benefited from a relationship with Merck. Cozar Hyzar was one of our inventions, and we benefited that. It was a very sad patent expiration that happened on April 10th of the year 2010. But what we do is work with other companies who are absolutely have the value chain knowledge and the knowledge of the human body in ways, and we provide them with some materials that they can then test and things like that. But we don't have that value chain, that information and intensity that we had, say, 15 years ago. So we're more back in the value chain and working from that aspect of it. But there's a lot going on in that area as well.
Back.
Byron Ween, Blackstone. What percentage of your sales is from products that have been developed by your company in the last 10 years? And if I asked you that question 10 years from now, what would the number be?
Well, I can't tell you 10 years, but I can tell you 5 years because we measure that actually. So what we've been driving is, how do you get a new product up that curve as quick as you can? So one of our measurements is revenue from products that didn't exist 5 years ago, and that number last year was $10 billion out of the $36 billion in revenue for our company. So we have Rynaxypyr was one of those, right? And that's falling out because it's now over 5 years old. So we constantly look at that from a pipeline standpoint, and we want to grow it because the facts are that there's some that are replacement and there's some that's growth, and you're constantly looking to see where that line is because we have to defend our territory. I mean, in our world, price goes down, not up without innovation. And you've got lots of competitors that are out there looking to knock it off.
Wow.
So the minimum's about 10. It needs, as we grow as a company, it will get larger from that.
And-
That's a very important metric for us.
Does that 10 include, you talked about the 3 different kinds of innovations, and the first kind were sort of incremental changes.
Right,
Does
includes all of it.
Includes that as well.
Yeah, and that's for our businesses, and we look at that, and the chief technology officer reports directly to me, and we look every quarter at his metrics around what each of the businesses are doing. And he helps the businesses by deploying some of the leverage resources to help them get it done faster, right? And so that's really important for us because we live and die by that.
Right here, and then over here.
Aaron Kinnery, the Partnership for a New American Economy. DuPont was founded by an immigrant. It's part of the 40% of Fortune 500 companies founded by immigrants or their children. You now sit at the center of several industries which rely on foreign talent at all skill levels. What would you say to folks in Washington where the issue seems to have stalled?
Well, that's stapling a green card to every advanced degree or PhD would be a real help. But, I'm not a Native American. My husband comes from Native American roots. I don't, right? So I came over in potato famine kind of days. And, families, just tremendous what a lot of hard work, focus, education can do for kids here. So, the model, it's been challenged, but why are we changing it now? I think it's an important part of who we are as a country, is the melting pot. And I think that we need to address it. Immigration, I think we needed to do it in a way that's very respectful. And understanding that talent, I want them to come here and get educated. I'd like them to stay. And work in our laboratories. Now, we're kind of lucky because if somebody comes here and gets educated and wants to go home, we may just have a big laboratory in that country and do that. But I think it's part of who we are as a nation, and we have to get after it.
Here and then here.
I'm Eric Levengood with Citigroup. I want to go back to a theme I think Byron was just touching on and some others. You mentioned that innovation or technology is getting more local, so local applications for local problems. but also talked about the benefits of scale, go-to-market. What's your process for taking raw innovation and then actually spreading it through the organization and then being able to get it so local? I go back to the Wall Street question, right? That inability to see how R&D investment translates into revenue X years from. How do you handle that internally?
Yeah.
How do you populate it?
You know, I tell you, that's sort of like the holy grail, right? And you just can't schedule it, is the problem. And what you're counting on is creating the venues for people to work together. So we've dotted, in the last 5 years, we've put innovation centers around the world to connect our people to customers to get in a way that enables them to see all of what DuPont has. They may, their entry into our company may be, you know, cultures for food ingredients, but they come in and we can talk to them about how grain's grown and protected. We can talk to them about packaging materials. We can talk to them about their plants and solar and alternate energy, and we can engage them in ways that allow them, that helps them understand and create project for us, but informs us as well. And those innovation centers are connected virtually to our 10,000 engineers and scientists around the world. And so we run competency centers. So our technical side of our company is run off of competency centers. And then we pull people on projects to create that growth. And by doing that, we can leverage that knowledge. You know, but it is something we work hard. We have what we call TechCon every year. It's the first day we bring in 4 or 5 global companies, and they talk to us in different breakout rooms for a full day about different aspects of their business and where opportunities are coming from. We then spend the rest of the week, it's just us, and it's our scientists and researchers, our engineers, our marketers, our business leaders. And I mean, as a young marketer in the company back in the late 80s, early 90s, I got some of my best ideas wandering through TechCon in poster sessions and seeing what other businesses were doing with interesting applications. And I'd come back with 10 ideas. I'd drive my poor head of research crazy. But it enabled us to then get in a room and talk about how can we use these ideas to better, would our customers be better served if we had these types of things in? So there's, I don't know what you call it. It's an innovation ecosystem that we absolutely work very hard at creating that connectedness and that leverageability, but for the most part, measure it about what it delivers to the customers.
Right here.
Thank you. Ronnie Heyman, GAF Corporation. We talked about corporate tax policy in the US, and you are a global company. And I just wonder whether you'd comment on government regulation, what you've seen with EPA, DEP, and so forth over the last 5 to 10 years, and how that informs your decisions whether to build a plant abroad or in the US. How do you feel about changes in regulatory policies?
Regulatory is increasing across the world in many different industries than historically it's been in. I mean, it's always been around food and drugs and agriculture and things like that. Now it's getting much broader. And so when we look to site a plant, we look at a lot of things. We look at the availability of talent. We look at the ability to protect our intellectual property. And a lot of the times that's manufacturing process technology. It's just not the molecule that's being worked on through the process. We look at what the taxing authorities, how they feel about that employment and what they're willing to bring to the table. And so all of those things come together. We look at the regulatory environment, and the regulatory environment's very different everywhere you go. And so we do have a pretty thorough analysis that comes down, and even if we say, okay, this plant's going to be in the United States because that's where it needs to be from an IP standpoint, state by state, it's very different. And there are a lot of states out there who are actively engaged and saying, pick me, and there are others that aren't.
I was really asking you about federal policy. I mean, I'm very well aware of the state level, but I just wondered how you felt about federal regulations and how they've changed.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because measurement technology has moved to the point where you can measure anything at any level. And so can you ever say can you ever use the word never, right? And you can't anymore, And so I think we are very active in working around, like even in the chemical side, TSCA reform. And how do you get it in a place where it serves the nation, it serves the population, but allows us to manufacture things that are important for our economy? And so that has changed. It's gotten stricter over the years, and I think that we continue to work there. It's not all bad. It's not all good. But it's a constant, I think, and the most important part about it is the engagement. We need to engage with them to have them understand the impacts of certain things that they're considering. At the same time, they need to help us understand it from their point of view. And so it is a lot more intense today than it ever has been.
But do you feel it good or bad? Do you feel it's rational?
Well, the interesting thing is that no matter where I operate in the world, I'm held to a U.S. standard. If I have an issue that occurs in China, it's not the Chinese standard they use, it's the U.S. standard they use. So I'm a believer I have to operate at that standard anyway, right? And so I think it's
But
not a matter of choice.
Does your competition have to operate at that?
No, they don't. No, it's clear. Now, the big competition, people that are more multinationals do. But the local competition does not.
Okay.
But even in places like China, we see that they're focused on, cleaning up some of that, and I think that's important for the world.
Other questions? Anyone want to take one last? Yes, go ahead, right over there.
Sorry. I just, listening to you, I think you're describing a positive role for government in the operation of big corporations. And the innovation centers, for example, that the federal government is setting up around the country might be an example. But I'm just wondering, to what extent, forget the politics of it or the competition with China and so forth, to what extent can any major innovative manufacturing company operate without some form of public subsidies, if you will, or support? And I mean that in a positive sense, not a negative sense.
Yeah, I'm not sure about subsidies, but look at infrastructure. It's important. I've got to move goods, and I need a strong rail. I need, strong highway infrastructure to move stuff in and out of my plants. I need an electric grid, access to natural gas, low-cost energy is all a positive. So that whole infrastructure thing is supportive of building out strong industry. And we need to make sure, I believe in a level playing field. So if the rules are the same for everybody, then I think we got a great chance at winning. And so helping create that level playing field on the regulatory side or things like that. So I do think that we benefit from it. I think some of the research that comes out of the government laboratories is very helpful, very informative. Because we do spend on long-term research. They spend on even longer-term research, and it really does help inform even some of the areas that we're working on the midterm. Midterm being 10 to 20 years type of thing. So I think it's an important part of an industrial ecosystem that we have to continue to focus on and be very vocal about what the needs are to create strong, competitive U.S. industry.
So before we close, I want to highlight the session coming up on January 16th, the Outlook for 2015, at which Byron Wien is going to tell us everything important that's going to happen next year. And I don't know if you want to, give us a head start on any of those. We'll wait until January 16th. Ellen, great conversation, fascinating and important set of issues. Thank you very much. Let's give her a round of applause.
Great, thank you.